Okay, so this is my second seminar on HyperKnowledge themes. There's not that much overlap between the first group and the second group, so I will maybe give a bit of context and recapitulate. The goal, the overall goal of HyperKnowledge is to enable people to basically create a model of their ideas. And that's both the data model and their visual model eventually, but we're not getting into that today. And to use that model of their own perspective to create a collective perspective and to embed them in a kind of global federated patchwork of different people's perspectives. So really, the goal is to have a good representation of collective viewpoints as a whole. What I'm going to dig into today is the single perspective view. What are perspectives made of? What is the what are the building blocks? So I will not speak about comparison between perspectives. I will not speak about visualizations. I was hoping to get into syntax and like the nitty-gritty of the data model, but I did not finish that to a point where I'm happy to present it. So this will be in the next presentation. But I really do want to look into what's my kind of ontology of what I expect to see on the HyperKnowledge data bus, if you will. What is it about? And since we're looking at single perspective, now, of course, it may be personal or a group, but it's the assumption is coherence. There's no notion of, yes, this person is saying this and this person is saying that at the same time. It's we agree on this is the group position on this. So I'm not getting into social truth, which I'll review later. Right now, we're just looking at a single perspective. Now, in that overall perspective, we still want to express and justify any position, any perspective on any issue. Allowed to compare a position in another, because even within a single perspective, we may want to do that. But the most important point is clarification. Are we saying the same thing? Is this statement the same as that statement? And this is really what I want to dig into. What does that? How do we represent two statements being the same and speaking about the same underlying entities? What are how can we identify implicit assumptions? How can we clarify things? And ideally, we want to situate a position with respect to existing position. Is it really a new position? Is it something that's been said before? Evaluate relatedness. That will be, again, a bit slightly out of scope, but it's still, I want us to keep it in mind as this is an overall goal. And refactoring. Things may look the same at a certain point. We may realize later on that actually there were two ideas there, or that two ideas are the same modulo with small sub-questions. So we can say, okay, here's what's common, here's what's different, and refactor things that way. So the idea is, the concepts are very fluid, and we want to be able to speak about this fluidity, describe this fluidity. On the other hand, I'm working, and I won't go deep into that right now, but I'm working with an event sourcing paradigm where we're dealing with immutable representations of concepts. So how to align this immutable nature of statements being made by someone at a given point in time with the fact that concepts are fluid and constantly evolving. So that's what I want to get into today. Questions? At this point, I want this to be more interactive. Last seminar was very much me presenting my ideas. Here I'm presenting, but I also want to invite questions and comments much more regularly. So feel free in writing if you have mic issues. But let me go on. So how to identify statements in a single perspective. A key point for me is distinction. So I explicitly don't want to use artificial intelligence or machine learning. I gave many reasons for that. One of them is the aspect of there's a lot, if we automate too much, nobody's imputable, nobody's in charge. And if we're speaking about a system that can ultimately be used for collective decision-making, you don't want too many black boxes in the process. So we want people to make decisions, not black boxes. I'm not saying AI has no role to play. It very much has a role to play in augmenting, helping, suggesting. But decisions must be materialized as this is a decision point. It's been maybe proposed by an AI, but it's being validated by a human being. So we want to make those explicit. And AIs look at overall things. They look at what's common in a big corpus. And here I'm looking at the distinctions. Well, this word could mean this or it could mean that. It's not about finding the greatest common denominator. It's about identifying the distinctions. The other way to identify statements is you can do it in language, of course, or you can build ontologies and formalize to be very precise about the statements you're making. But building and using ontologies is a specialized skill. And I want this to be in broad usage. I spoke before in the first seminar of progressive formalization. People should be able to recognize what is there, even if the concept is in a formal form, it should be related to non-formal form. They should be able to contribute natural language contributions. Oh, hi, Michael. I did start basically setting the agenda for today, and I'm mostly going to go into just overall goals. The single perspective mode. I'm not going to go into alignment federation today. This is what a single perspective looks like. And the overall goal is especially the clarification of concept operation. So how to identify statements. So one way is machine learning, but it tends to erase distinctions, and I want to focus on distinctions. The other way to identify distinctions is with ontologies and vocabularies, but that's a specialized skill. And I want this to be more an informal way to establish distinctions. And more important, we cannot assume agreement on a single formal model, especially as I'm looking into the anatomy of claims. There's many ways to, like logicians will assume that claim can be, it can be propositional calculus. No, actually it needs to be first order calculus, higher order calculus, or modal calculus, or Bayesian logic. And all these models are good and valid and useful. And the point is actually fixing a model is an anti-goal. And this is really important for me. So progressive formalization is my answer to, ontologies are a specialized skill. We want to allow people to enter things one at a time. And what I want to do is kind of a model of the meta model that would allow me to compare statements that use different formalisms, whether it's common logic or modal logic or something else. I don't want to impose a choice. I will propose a model of, well, this is one possibility of how statements could be formalized, because we need to have a kind of reference model, but there must be, the system, the HyperKnowledge system must be flexible enough if it's going to be a lingua franca between systems to allow comparing statements that use different formalizations. And the point is, what are the links between statements? And that's what I mean by formalize the meta model. So this is what I'm trying to identify. What are the key entities, the key relations between statements that allow me to have this conversation about, are we saying the same thing? Still, it's interesting to look about some formal models and see what they bring to the table and what is it we're trying to compare. And I just picked a few key features from each of the models I'm going into, and I could go in depth into each of those, and it may be useful, and feel free to ask questions. But I really want to kind of give a bird's eye view so we can think, what is the meta model like that could allow statements made in any of those to be compared. So what do we have in, for example, OWL, which is the ontology language that sits atop RDF. There are, I don't know if any other was, there's a RDF schema, and Shackle now is an alternative. But basically in OWL, we have entities have types. So there is an instance of, subclass of relationship. Entities have properties. So because it's of this type, it can have this property. This property has type constraints. Its domain and codomain are for the given property. And one thing that's a bit more higher level in OWL that I think is really important is the notion of type partition. So you can say this type, this type, this type, this type are mutually exclusive. Something, if something is one of them, it cannot be of the other. In topic maps, I've learned about the importance of topic splitting and merging, this infamous end-to-end relation, many-to-many relationship between the name of concepts, symbols of concepts, and closer to Peircean language, and the concepts themselves. And that means as we discuss, and because concepts are fluid, it means that a topic or topic proxy, to be more accurate, that is the entity we use to speak about the concept. It can merge. We can decide these two topics are actually speaking about the same thing, or it can split. We found a new distinction in this concept. Another idea from topic mapping that I think is relevant is that of legends. A legend is basically saying two topics should be made if this and this and this properties are the same. And this is domain specific. In this domain, we use this legend to identify topics. These are not necessarily things I want to do, but I want to think about what it means. What it means is we have a kind of constraint language over identity constraints. And I think that's important. Common logic is a superset of first order, close to first order calculus. It's a formalization of first order calculus that has been accepted as an ISO standard. I find it extremely interesting because, well, first it's based on predicate and predicate calculus and first order logic. And I think a lot of what happens in language, like first order logic was one of the first attempts to formalize language. And it's still a pretty good attempt. It's hard for people to get used to because some of the meanings of some of the operators are not exactly intuitive, but the basic intuition that we have variables representing entities, we have predicates, and the predicates are n-ary functions that say, well, do these variables fit that predicate or not? And we have quantifiers in first order logic as opposed to predicate calculus. So basically assertions that this predicate formula is true for all instances of a certain variable, or for at least one, or for exactly one instance of a certain variable. There exists a unique X such that this can be said to be true of that X. I think that's extremely important for assembling claims. Claims are not disconnected, they're connected in language. Every claim refers to all previous claims, if you think of a sequence of claims. And being able to say, well, this entity and this claim is the same as that entity and this claim. That's kind of table stakes. Conceptual graphs are introduced by SOA. Well, I'm speaking about the version introduced by SOA. He makes the point that it's in some ways equivalent to superset of common logic with higher order logic. Higher order logic means you can quantify over predicates, but more important in SOA is the notion of subgraphs. So you can make statements about statements. And for me, that's fundamental to HyperKnowledge. You can say, Mary thinks that, Paul believes that, Mary came that day. You know, these you create, or you can, if this were true, I think I may have mentioned Fauconnier's work on mental spaces, highly inspired, saying it's easy for us in language to create an alternative reality. The example Fauconnier give is, if you were a better painter, the girl in the painting would have blue eyes. And so this is creating an alternate reality if you were a better painter. And how does that hypothesis create all kinds of counterfactuals? We reason in counterfactuals all the time. We make predictions, we compare possibilities, and being able to speak about claims without asserting them or negating them is essential. And a frame model was introduced by Minsky, Society of Mind. And frame model, it's a bit like frame is a bit like a predicate, in that it's an array predicate with slots. But a slight difference is that the slots or the roles in the frame model, role is a term from topic mapping, but I think it's appropriate to use roles instead of slots. The roles are, some of them have constraints and some of them have defaults. So you can say, if I say, you know, John gave a car to Mary, I'm not saying what make of car, it's implied that it's just a car, and some things are left under-specified, and that's fine. When did it happen? Obviously, it happened at a point in time. I don't have to say it. I can ask, when did it happen? So I can instantly make the missing terms topical. And that's very important. Something may never be referred to again. And then it's just an indeterminate variable, and something may be referred to after the fact. And then it becomes a topic, it becomes a named variable. And this is, in a way, when we're speaking about claims or even entity definitions, which are a form of claim, we are saying we have a predicate, we have variables for each of the roles. And if every predicate introduces all the variables, that's a lot of variables and potential entities, but it's the entity unification that allows us to keep the number of entities manageable. And of those, only a few will be referred to externally. And those are the named variables, those that can be extracted from scope. Variables have scopes, and I won't get deep into scopes, but it's very important also. And those are the ones that can be compared. But it's important to be able to create a scope variable after the fact, even if it wasn't explicitly mentioned, because anything can be questioned, anything can become topical. So I'm very much focusing on, I'm saying, in a way, for me, a good model of statements is turn them into frames with variables, as in common logic, eventually subgraphs, because the frame itself is a unit and can be spoken about, so that allows us to define subgraphs, and with the possibility of splitting and merging concepts a posteriori, as in topic maps. So if we look at concepts, now let's go back. I spoke in the previous seminar about the Peircean triangle, right? There's this triangular relationship between a symbol, or what Peirce more appropriately called the sign carrier, for example, a bit of text. The idea it refers to, the signifier, what I can call in the concept here, and the external entity, if any. Now, sometimes there's no external entity. If it's an abstract concept, there's no external entity. And there's a lot of subtleties, such as, for example, the symbol may be the entity, may play the role of the entity. It's the difference between saying cats have 4 legs and cats has 4 letters. Here I'm using cats as, not as the symbol referring to another entity, but as the entity itself. It's a quoted symbol in that sense. So there's subtleties, but generally the notion that we have symbol and concept and eventually external entity, but we're dealing mostly with discourse, and we're mostly dealing with I'll kind of neglect the external entity reference. A lot of what we're dealing with is documents, which are digital entities, and where there's a kind of strange equation between the symbol and the entity itself. So there are ways the triangle can be collapsed. Nonetheless, the basic relation is the interpretation relation. Somebody, both the emitter and the receptor of the communication act, interpret the symbol as being about a concept. Now, or the concept is named by symbols. Again, that's a many-to-many relationship. Now, I was very reluctant to materialize concepts because as soon as you materialize a concept, you give it a name, and that's another symbol, really, and you haven't touched the concept. I would say, oh, let's just use equivalence class of concepts. And really, that is what of symbols. And really, that's what a concept is. It's an equivalence class of symbols. Still, I now think it's important to materialize the equivalence class. So that means everything that's named in red is, I think, a fundamental relation or frame in the meta model. We have interpretation, so that's a relation between a symbol and not the concept, because we don't have access to concept, but the topic proxy or concept proxy, this materialized concept, which is still a symbol, but I want the system I'm building to have, an explicit ontology that includes symbols and materialized concepts as distinct entities. And the relation between those is many-to-many. It's the many interpretations from a symbol to a context and the many names of a context, which are so many symbols. And we can say this, in a way, the equivalence class is given implicitly by saying those two symbols can be interpreted as the same concept. In a single perspective, as opposed to the global federation perspective, we can ask that concepts have a distinct representation. Now, there are many symbols that can name that concept, but we should be able to pick a few. There's using the axiom of countable choice here, I guess. Pick a few in such a way that each distinguishable concept has if I take the representatives as a subset of the concepts naming the subset of the symbol naming the concepts, those representatives will not overlap. There will no be two representatives pointing to the same concept. And that's just a way of picking a subset of the naming symbols such that there's no overlap. Now, sometimes they may be hard. This may be hard to do. It may be hard to build, but within the single perspective, I'm claiming it's doable without proof. Questions? The kind of equivalence relations I'm drawing here between symbols and concepts, is that clear enough? Should have done more diagrams. Sorry, this was finished a bit at the last second.
It seems clear. Yeah.
Seems clear. Thank you. Okay. So representation is now a concept may still have multiple representations. I'm not saying the representation is unique. Why? Because again, of progressive formalization, it's possible to say, well, let me represent this concept as a natural language sentence, and maybe more than one even, as long as there's never overlap. And I can try to formalize the concept, whether it's a statement or an entity definition, as some formula of some formal logic. And each formal logic may be a different formula, so the point is not to impose a single formalization process. Each system may have its own formalization process. However, as long as we're saying, well, these two are equivalent, point to the same concept, we're able to say they're equivalent. And so this is a very explicit, are we pointing to the same concept object? And if we look at the concept, look at all the representation and all the names, we should see, yes, there's indeed, we are speaking about the same thing. Of course, we may contest that. That's the next slide. Representations should aim to be unambiguous. What do I mean by this? It is, as I said, a symbol can point to multiple concepts. I don't think it's reasonable to require that the representing symbols never point to many concepts, because often new interpretations can be discovered a posteriori. So it's entirely possible that a symbol is representative for the concept, but could still be interpreted as other concepts, as long as it's not a representative of these other concepts. So the aim is to make that ambiguous. And if there's ambiguity, maybe you should choose a new representative. The representative can be modified. I said concepts are immutable, but then you'll basically say this concept is obsoleted by this other revised concept with a new representative. Representation must be self-contained. That is, it should be read as a whole without preference to external text outside it. It's not indexical in linguistic terms. Like when you say, this is great, what is this? That's an indexical sentence. If you say, a lot of what I'm speaking about is being developed in the context of the canonical debate. And as such, we're having these discussions a lot. And we've been using the Paris is great as an example of an ambiguous sentence. What Paris do we mean? Which city, Paris, Texas, Paris, France, or do we mean the person, Paris, the hero in the Iliad, or Paris Hilton, or, what do we mean? And what do we mean by great? And we can be more precise, it's ambiguous, but it's, we may discover some of those possibilities after the fact. I don't know how many people thought of Paris, the hero of the Iliad, when I said Paris is great, and it's normal. The point of doing formal representations is that ideally, when we make a formal representation, it should be unique for its formalism. There should not be a way to have two equivalent formal sentences for a single concept. Of course, that depends on the formalism. It may be true for certain formalisms and not for others, but that's an aim. So this is what I said about frames. I got a bit out of order here, but if statements are described as frames, now this is, again, a model. What is this about? If frames are a model, this is not mandatory, but I think a lot of the ideas here are important. If a statement is a frame, that is, in every relation, that's a kind of schema language. So we would have a schema language for frames. Again, we can use something like OWL or other schema languages. What is important is we need to be able to describe when an actor is the same across multiple statements, the variable unification part of it. And that means we're able to say, oh, look, we have this actor in this frame. I'm, again, going into next slide. But I really want to say, if we take frames as minimal reference implementation language for HyperKnowledge, and I think it still makes sense, we can express a lot that is in frames. For example, if we want to express entities and classes as we have in OL, well, an OL class is a predicate. We're saying this is a member of this class, is saying this entity corresponds to this predicate. It is true that this entity corresponds to this predicate. And entities, they're variables, but variables are problematic for all kinds of reasons. But one thing they are also is they are the target of the sign frame, like the Peircean triangle frame, or in other words, and especially the representation frame. I'm saying this representation relation, this is the way I can name entities, and naming entities is how I can anchor variables. Say, well, this variable, which has this name, or corresponds to the entity which has this name, and that's one of the frames. And then I can use that to not depend on variables. Why do I not want to depend on variables? I'll get there. If we do entity identification from text, either automatic or as humans, we have a bit of text, and speaking about this and speaking about that, and here are those are names of entities. So again, we may want to verify which concept are we speaking of. There may be multiple. We have to disambiguate ideally, maybe progressively. But if we don't do it, we must be explicit that we have not done the disambiguation process, especially if we identify a text that happens to be a concept representative. Do we mean the concept, or do we mean all the concepts that could be interpreted from this phrase, from this symbol? So the translation of a statement to a sentence, and when we identify the component entities of that statement, we must be very careful. Are we doing the work of identifying the underlying concept? Or no, we are not doing that yet. We're doing a first pass progressive formalization, and then we're just speaking about the names, the symbols, and it could be any concept interpretable from that name. So even if somebody decides to not use frames, I think it's important that we are able to identify the entities referenced in the statement. So that's one of the, again, fundamental relations in the meta model. And the equivalent entities in related statements. That's the variable unification. And when we have question, and I'm not sure about this yet. That's part of what I'm still working. I mean, not all of this is final. Is the variable unification equivalence the same as the statement equivalence? I'm not sure, but I suspect it is. But what is clear is that in either case, the equivalence on entities that is used for entity unification allows me to, it can be extended to equivalence relation on statements and to all concepts. Most statements are either, most concepts are either statements or entity definitions. There may be other, I'm still wavering on this one, but clearly we've covered a lot of cases between those two, because statements is an extremely broad definition. And what's a statement, by the way? I didn't get into that in the slides, but I would decompose a statement into sometimes it's called the posit, but the posit also erases negation. That's not what I mean. But the propositional content, if you will, and the truth value. This is something I mentioned more in the first presentation, but the notion that if I say it is true that climate change will lead to disaster. It is likely that climate change will lead to disaster. It is plausible that climate change will lead to disaster. Those are all different statements that differ only in truth value, not in propositional content. It is false that it's also, it's a bit of a special case negation. But anyway, it's possible to decompose statements, and it's important later on, but I don't want to get deep into that today. But this decomposition is important in that a lot of these are meta statements. But we can, no, it's not that way. What I mean is it's important to be able to identify statements that differ only in truth value, not as identical, but as having the same underlying posit. It creates another equivalence class. And that's why I said we can say most things as statements. Now, I spoke a lot about equivalence. The other side is distinction. If we want to say this is equivalent, we want to say, no, this is not equivalent. We change our mind, we discovered a new distinction. So a distinction is, again, it's an in-ary relation, that way it's a frame. It's saying that two or more concepts are distinct. And that's very much like the old distinction, the old disjoint schema. But also, I think in a distinction, I would tend to say, are there statements that are uniquely true of any of the categories? That's not mandatory, but it's highly suggested. Why? Because it makes for more useful conversations. I mean, if I'm saying, no, that's not the same, okay, how is it not the same? And so there should be a kind of burden of, not of proof, but of explicitness on anybody trying to introduce a distinction, just by the structure of the distinction operator, that the distinguishing statement is requested slot, not mandatory, but requested. We can also have the abstract superclass as part of the distinction operator. I think it makes sense to, we can express subclass of using propositional calculus. Every member of class X expressed as a proposition is a member of class Y. That's subclassing. But I think it's interesting to also do it at the level of distinctions. And that way, it allows us to define abstraction, which is the symmetric relation distinction, explicitly as an erasure of a specific distinction. We're saying this is the distinction we're not considering when we make this abstraction. And again, I think it makes for a clearer, more explicit notion of abstraction. That sentence was not finished, sorry, but I think the idea is sound. A bit more about formalizations. So ideally, we want formalization uniqueness. We are speaking a lot in canonical debate about canonicality, meaning we want a formalization that gives each statement a unique signature. That unique signature should be well-defined, and so that if somebody comes up with a new, that was one of the early goals stated at the beginning, if someone comes up with another formulation of a claim, the process of formalization should arrive at the same formalization with the same signature, so that we can say, hey, this has already been said, and you're just reinforcing that pre-existing statement and adding a new formulation, which is valuable. So that's a deduplication aim of discourse analysis. Now, if we use frames and we use variables and variable unification, it means that the signature is not unique, because it depends on variable names, it depends on the order of variables, it depends on the order of unification. So all of this makes signature fail. And we can use the sign frame, or especially the representative frame, as I said, to provide an anchor. Like we can say this variable is grounded in this name, which has this representative statement, and that can found the variable unification in something well-defined. That means that the signature becomes unique again. But as I said, the representative statement of a concept can change as the concept gets refined. So that means we must mark a concept that is grounded in obsolete, in another obsolete concept. We must mark it as needing reevaluation. It's possible that the original concept is still usable, but it's also possible that it's not usable anymore and that the concept signature needs to be recomputed by, I think it should be a flag so that people check, yeah, well, if especially in the case of a fork, if a concept has been, a new distinction has been introduced. So the concept can mean this or that. We want to know, well, which branch should the old claim apply to? Maybe both, maybe the abstract subconcept if it's meaningful. It may or may not be meaningful. But either way, we need to know that it's been updated. So this is a burden of update, but I think it's necessary for consistency. Hopefully forks, reevaluations will be frequent, but forks will be comparatively rare after a while. Again, within a single perspective. Across perspective is another story. And the other obvious solution, besides keeping reevaluating statements, is to give a unique non-linguistic attribute to identifier to concepts like UUID or SHA sum or whatever. And part of me loves IPLD and loves SHA sums and content addressable identifiers. And I totally believe in the value of that. But what I want to make clear is that if concepts evolve, it doesn't matter that you used a UUID or SHA sum or whatever. There's still going to be concept evolution. You still have to follow it. And it doesn't obviate the need for calculating the impact of concept evolution on claims that use this concept. It can appear to do so, and it can reduce the need. That's what well-defined concepts are about. But this is what it's about. And sorry, Jack is asking. Where was I? Okay, confused about what representation is. Okay, fair enough. What I meant by representation is when I have the many-to-many relation between symbols and concepts, the representative is the symbol that is chosen as a distinct representative of this concept. Among all the names this concept can have, we pick one that we won't pick as representative for any other concept. So it's the name of the most unique name of the concept, if you will. It may still be ambiguous, but we've picked it as in this discursive space. This is the name we've picked as representing this concept. That's what I mean by representation. Does that answer your question, Bill? Okay. Identifiers are still names. Yeah, and I'm saying, yeah, using non-linguistic identifiers, which would be another representative, it's fine. There's nothing against doing that, but I'm saying it does not, you may believe it reduces the need for change propagation of concepts. I don't think it does beyond a certain point. Of course, you can be more precise if you're referring to, say, an existing ontology that is well done, such as, for example, chemistry ontologies, like the entities are well defined, the names are well defined. Wonderful, you've got yourself unambiguous concepts, but it won't work all the time, is what I'm saying. And another case of concept evolution is you had an implicit variable in your frame that didn't need naming because it was not referred to. Now somebody from another context says, well, what about this? And then gives it a name. And that means it's now part of the concept. So evolution is something that, concept evolution is something that happens. So we have, if we have concept evolution, we have the immutable expression and we have the mutable status. What is the concept now? So it must be very easy and convenient to just query the system and say, okay, what is the latest version of that concept? Or the latest versions, plural, if there's been a concept split. So this defines in a way a refinement relation. This concept is a refinement of a previous version of the concept, and possibly there's multiple refinements if there's a fork or a split. And as I said, sometimes the fork is meaningful, such as, sorry. Sorry to, Jack is asking me for the address. Where was I? Yes. Yeah. If there's a refinement, it's possible that it's a homonymy. I gave the example of Paris. I gave 4 different meanings of the word Paris. It's extremely unlikely that anybody will ever want to make a statement that speaks about all 4 in a meaningful way, other than to say, hey, they have the same name. But that apart, there's very few meaningful, useful statements that can be made about the abstraction of all 4. Whereas if I say, for example, people speak about climate change, some people define it in a way that includes or excludes ocean acidification. These are this is a nuance of what do we mean by the phrase climate change. They're 2 distinct concepts, with or without, but in a lot of sentences, it doesn't matter. We say climate change will cause, will have a huge impact on human population. It doesn't matter which one I mean, and I may disregard the distinction. That's what I mean by nuance versus homonymy. Is the englobing abstraction meaningful in its own right or not? Why does it matter to have that distinction between nuance and homonymy? Because old statements do not need to be refined, may not need to be refined in the case of nuance. It's absolutely imperative that they be refined and updated in the case of homonymy, because the abstracting overlap is meaningless. So basically, I've defined a refinement relation between concepts, and it should overlap with the interpretation of the underlying symbols. Like if this concept is represented by symbols, there should at least be a few symbols among the names of the concepts whose interpretations will correspond to the refinements. And okay, 1 second. Being distracted. Oh, that's horrible. And I've lost my page. Brilliant. No, I'm giving up. Where was I? Okay, sorry. So that's concept evolution. Situated symbols. Another thing about symbols, often a symbol will be taken in a document. That means that they have a context. And obviously, the interpretations of the symbol in context will be more precise than the interpretations of the symbol out of context. The interpretations, because we have access to the concept to disambiguate the entities referred to in the statement. It's my belief, well, of course, that's a platform choice, that there's very few cases where it's useful to have interpretation of a decontextualized symbol that cannot be traced back to an instance, a situated instance of the symbol. But that is something we're discussing a lot in the Canonical Debate Lab. One thing we, many of us in the Canonical Debate Lab want to be able to treat standalone, non-indexical, non-ambiguous claims as equivalent to the symbols. And I'm basically making the argument today that since ambiguity is something that's evolving, it is important to distinguish the concept from its symbol representation and make them two different objects. It also makes better sense to attach distinguishing claims, distinctions and abstractions to the concept than its representative symbol. So this is the big piece of ontology I'm asking you all to consider in the HyperKnowledge ontology. And sorry, I was still writing this, but the last, I think this is almost a complete list of the key relations. The last one, of course, is the one needed for argumentation, and that's a frame. It's a statement between two statements saying that this statement supports or opposes another statement. So it's a frame. So in a way, is that part of the model or the meta model? It's kind of in between. I think it's important that we can speak about these relations in the meta model. So it will also be in the meta model, but it will very much also belong in each formalizations model, the argumentation relation. But I think what needs to be extracted at the kind of meta level of that is shared between HyperKnowledge participating systems is the notion of interpretation between symbols and concepts, names, notion of representation, including formal representation, the equivalence classes, the parts whole, the reference between a statement and its component, or a statement and another statement in the case of composite statement, and the, of course, the variable unification between related statements. and the notion of distinction and abstraction. I think those are kind of key building blocks. And I'm basically claiming that with those key building blocks, you can describe anything just by naming predicate, by adding a set of predicates. Now, of course, what's your set of predicates? Like, for example, you could use the Stanford FrameNet as a set of predicates. They have a good frame vocabulary. But the point is, it should not matter because it's possible to use equivalence and distinction to map any set of predicate you choose to any other set of predicates someone else chooses. And this is the basic statement about the meta statement, the meta model I'm trying to build. Now, in the next seminar, I'll speak a bit about syntax, and I will go into data and modeling, and I'm not sure in which order I'll do that, I will go deeper into how to extend this at the federation level. A perspective has a choice of representation, another perspective has a different choice of representation. How do you do the mapping between statements in different perspectives that have not chosen the same grounding? And that's really the key of HyperKnowledge federation. But I wanted to know what entities we're talking about, concepts and symbols, aka statements, entity definitions. Do you want a stronger word than should in statement about refinement? Good question.
Look, here's my thing. I really appreciate what you're doing, and I kind of understand some of it, but I look at this as when you say there was another one where you use the word should, we should do this. And it's actually, I think in the system you're looking at is like, no, this is what we do so that we don't have this ambiguity. We do this. Because if we don't do this, it'll be, so I think in some cases, what you're asking for is to just be more flat-footed and don't make it a like, well, if you care to. It's like, no. It's just a, I think I don't know, I'm going to encourage you to be more, you can be more assertive about what the requirements are, so that like I can actually use these words that you're using,
No, you're what? I think in this case, you're absolutely right. This is actually a must. I'm just very sensitive to the evolutionary aspect of this. Somebody is curating a perspective and somebody is assigning representations to concepts. And of course, the system should disallow reusing a representation. And that way, yes, it's a must in this case. But I think a lot of the other shoulds, and I said should aim to, a lot of the other things are aspirational because it's something that will go wrong. And what we need is repair mechanisms rather than making it impossible. Like, for example, representations should aim to be ambiguous. Here it's really should aim to be. But I agree. In this case, concepts must have distinct representations. This is one of the few absolute enforcements. So absolutely well taken. Anything else? This did not go as far as I wanted for today, but I've been honestly waffling a lot about, do I use symbols as proxies for concepts or do I materialize concepts? And yeah, the notion that I'm doing both in a way, because I'm using the symbols as representatives and at the same time I'm materializing concepts, because this is what I'm hanging a lot of the relations to. I'm not hanging them to the symbols, I'm hanging them to the concepts. And this took a while to get right, so to speak. But now I'm fairly confident I can build a data model out of this. I have a question to you all. Does this sound like do you see another way to achieve those goals? Or am I'm engaging in something very complex because I'm thinking of a lot of edge cases of ambiguity and miscommunication. My starting point has been looking at false agreements, people who thought they were saying the same things and found out they weren't when looking more carefully at what they meant and what they said. And so this is what I'm trying to address. Can anyone see a simpler way of doing this than basically identifying distinctions and identifying distinguishing characteristics when there is a disagreement about what a name means? Which is, in a way, all I'm saying here in very long-winded fashion.
I don't know if there's an easy, I mean, amongst us humans, as opposed to say, you know, the little piece of silicon on my desk here, we're pretty skilled at this back and forth and, you know, basically improvising conversations or discussions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, from my own experience, if one of my buttons gets pushed, then some part of me that I haven't really recognized, you know, this happened to me once at a conference I was at where I was in a conversation with some, you know, researchers and stuff, and somebody said something and I could feel the hair on my neck go back up. And all I did, I was the smartest thing I've ever done in my life. I said, okay, I got to leave and take a walk. I'll talk to you guys later. Because I realized whatever else I said was not going to be, it was not going to go well. You know,
right.
So I think for me, when I look at this, is if we really want, you know, these, you know, dumber than silicon computers to try and help us, then we do have to specify some way that we, you know, when the computer says, oh, by the way, Bill, here's your only logical choice. I'm like, yeah, well, you know, thank you, but I'm going to go do it anyway. You know, or thanks, I hadn't seen that.
Right.
You know,
I agree totally. I think that when I say I can expect consistency within a perspective, it's up to a certain point. It shouldn't be enforced too much. Unique naming may already be too much to ask, but I think that getting people to be precise about names will help be able to say, okay, maybe when you're saying that this is a good reason to believe that, you're not speaking about the same thing.
Oh, no, I think that's correct. I mean, that happens so much. But I don't know, do you know that paper from 1770 something or other by a fellow named Giffords? It was in a book that Tom DeMarco wrote as an addendum, but he wrote The Ethics of Belief. I'll send a link out. This is a tremendous paper because he was actually querying people about what gives you the right to have a belief. You know,
okay.
And like for me, like we have, you know, I have representatives in Congress and they say all kinds of stuff. And my argument to them is, but since you represent, you know, 1 million people, you just cannot believe whatever you want. That's not ethical. What you need to do is show me evidence for why you believe what you believe. Anyway, there's some connection here about what we need to do. And I think also having the systems we're starting to rely on be reliable.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Making epistemic links explicit is a key goal for me. Like, why do I believe this? And what I'm trying to do is the epistemic links, the argument links, the causal inference, all of this, for me, that's kind of in the choice of a formal model. But for example, some people do these extremely detailed Bayesian analysis, and it's extremely important that they do so. But I think it should be possible for someone to have a more informal, modal logic. This is possible, plausible, or, I believe this for whatever reason, and then be able to compare whatever they achieved this in this simpler model to what came out of the Bayesian model, and have a conversation between both. And for me, that's an explicit goal of having a protocol, a kind of ecosystem of tools that operate on mental representation and models of the world and models of belief and models of belief, really, perspectives, and interoperate about them.
Well, that's really fascinating. I mean, I'm a thermodynamicist, so, for me, the ideal gas law still works. It's pretty ideal, but, if you increase the pressure on the thing in that can, it's, it's going to get warmer. It's just like, so, so I think it's valuable to present it, but I mean, I like what you're trying to do. And I think you're onto some way of actually being able to specify it. I have a whole bunch of notes I took that I might try and send some things, but
please do.
Because I was trying to write out definitions, blah, blah, equal, blah, so.
Yeah, that's, I was hoping to be more formal today, and I spent so much time revising some of the things that this is a bit less well-defined than I hope, but I think I'm definitely on the way to formality. Do I see cell division, forking one entity represented by the signature of subscribers to a belief? I'm not sure I understand the question.
I can clarify that. So there is a concept or an entity that is singularly represented that has different properties attributed to it by different observers or different thinkers,
perspectives. Yeah.
Perspectives. Is that one thing, or does it become the multiple things that it is seen to be?
I realize I left out a key concept, and that is the notion of definitional property. There are, given a given concept, and let me take, I often take the example of mammals. Mammals are defined as producing milk, to nourish their youngs. And now they've been kind of redefined in cladistic terms. There's this evolutionary branching tree, and it's this point in the evolutionary branching tree, the descendants of this, whatever. But at some point, before we knew about platypi, it was believed that all mammals were viviparous. And then we discovered platypus. And in a way, we could have decided to that the key clade we cared about was the I'm trying to remember the name of the platypus are monotremes, and the non-platypi are something else, and I forgot that name. We could have decided to attach mammal to that clade instead of the clade, but because it was built into the name mammals, that it was about milk, and that included platypi, so okay, platypi are mammals, and we stopped our belief about all mammals are viviparous. But what's important, what I'm trying to say here is there's some statements that are believed true about all members of a group, of a class, of a type, which if they turn out to be false, you'll revise your beliefs. And there's some other beliefs, if they turn out to be false, you'll call it something else. You could not say mammals don't all produce milk. We'll have to have another name for it if it doesn't correspond to not producing milk. And that's not totally true. Again, I mean, we could imagine an animal that is definitely in the mammalia clade, and that's why I said that the meaning of mammal shifted to the clade rather than to the milk producing. So if there were a non-milk producing mammal in the mammal clade, we'd still call it a mammal because the meaning has shifted. That's really interesting. But the question of, forget the cladistics development, the notion of mammals were defined as milk producing and viviparous, but in the last analysis, when we found out something that contradicted this combination of characteristics, one was definitional and the other was empirical. And I think if I had asked the biologist before platypus were discovered, suppose we discovered these animals that have these characteristics, right? Suppose I had found a viviparous non-milk producing, is that a mammal? They'd have said no. Suppose we found what turned out to be a platypus, would that be a mammal? They'd have said yes, because there was this a priori intuition that the milk producing was definitional and the viviparous was empirical. And when I say what are the distinguishing characteristics, I very much intend for people to make that distinction and to put the definitional characteristics there and not the empirical characteristics. Now, it's perfectly true that people will try to game the system by including their set beliefs, their set opinions and claim that this is empirical and claim that this is definitional, which is fine up to a point, because then we can say, well, we're not speaking about the same thing because you included this statement, and I don't believe this is empirically true. This is not part of my definition. I have a different one, and we want to know that these definitions are distinct if we have different beliefs. Like I often give the example of when I speak about nuance versus homonymy, I'm saying there are border cases. What's socialism? The socialism as defined by Karl Marx, Mitch McConnell, or Bernie Sanders are three very, very, very different concepts that have less in common than they have distinct. Is that homonymy or is that nuance? I think it's on the spectrum much more towards homonymy at this point. But identifying what do you believe to be the essential characteristics of socialism is a question that it's perfectly valid to ask both parties. And it will be, and this is what you'll find. A lot of people thought that the thing should start now.
Yeah, there was, I saw that there was a little,
yeah.
Well, I got to get off in a few minutes here.
Yeah, and I do have a hard stop at 20 minutes past anyway. So
anyway, this was really, really interesting. Sorry I missed the first one. It's not the best time for me with other things going on in the casa. So I'll just, I'll study late at night.
Okay.
Thanks much.
Yeah.
And thank you. And I will be continuing the series, and I hope I'll see some of you again.
Are you switching to Fridays in general, trying to, or?
I'm trying to see what works for people.
Yeah.
And I had 4 people on Tuesday, and then some people said, oh, I couldn't make Tuesday. And then I tried Friday, and a lot of people said, okay, I'd prefer Friday. And there was a misunderstanding about the time. And well, So,
Yeah. Well, this is possible for me if this turns out to be a time. Tuesday is actually slightly better for me, but though I did miss one accidentally.
Okay.
So, but all good. All right.
Okay, goodbye, folks. Thank you.
Thanks so
Bye.
much.
Thanks.